Welcome to the Psychedelic Diaries. I am your host, Ray Christian, and we have a show for you today. Today, we will be discussing the cannabis lessons for psychedelics, single issue politics, and of course, experiences on large doses of magic mushrooms. Ryan Munevar of Decriminalize California will be here for a deep dive and a soul search. But first, as usual, let's start things off with a nugget and a noodle. In today's news nugget, add Washington, Oklahoma, and the Commonwealth of Virginia to the state-level psychedelic party. All of them are now reviewing initiatives to legalize or decriminalize psychedelics, and the latter two, OK State and VA, are traditionally conservative, red states that haven't even yet legalized cannabis, and yet here we are with psychedelics. What a delightful development. And as for the noodle, something I've been noodling on of late, do psychedelics make you better in the bedroom? And I'm not talking about during the session, but in the days, weeks, and months after. Now, previous research, such as Dr. Jim Fadiman's trials in the 1960s, indicates that yes, psychedelics do enhance bedroom abilities. And more recent research has two interesting findings. One was expected. Brains on psychedelics have enhanced neuroplasticity, becoming more active and connected. The other was a surprise. The part of the brain responsible for the default mode network was much more quiet, kind of like a Tesla at a stoplight. Well, what does that mean for intimacy? Perhaps the more connected brain may enhance the novelty of the sensory inputs of sexual activity. And perhaps the quieter default mode network means you are more in the moment and more present with your sexual partner. Now, in my experience, the answer is a resounding yes. Intimacy is better post-journey, and you're better at it. Something to noodle on. Well, let's move on. Our next guest is the head of Decriminalize California, a movement to get psilocybin legalization on the California prop vote. This grassroots effort is picking up steam, and he is doing yeoman's effort for the psychedelic movement. Campaign Director Ryan Munevar, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ray.
Well, let's dive right in. You are the man behind this California psilocybin initiative, and I remember watching Ken Burns' excellent alcohol documentary, Prohibition, and being reminded of the power of single-issue politics. And you had many different psychedelic options to choose from. Why did you choose psilocybin?
Well, I didn't originally. I started out in cannabis, and after working on a bunch of different initiatives for that, they were basically open source draft documents that we put together on Google Drive. The basic foundations and techniques to use this for other substances came up. And it was actually a pretty big debate amongst my peers and friends about whether or not we should go for all substances, just psychedelics, or specific ones like, for example, psilocybin in a form of magic mushrooms. And the biggest one is honestly the most honorable one, to decriminalize all substances to some capacity. And the marketing just wasn't there for it to see if we'd actually get the vote. And when it came to psychedelics in general, there was too much confusion about all the different substances, both synthetic and natural, that existed out there. And the ones that scored the highest, as far as what the average person understood, was basically a cross between acid, LSD, and magic mushrooms. And magic mushrooms, since it already grew out there as it was, and I personally like growing it as it is, so I was so familiar with it, that's the one we went with.
Fantastic. I'm with you. I think psilocybin, quite frankly, is the Mona Lisa of all of them. And to lump all of the psychedelics in there together, it's just a little bit too confusing. So I appreciate the laser focus. You mentioned cannabis, Ryan, and you were heavily involved in that space. What lessons can we take from the legal evolution of cannabis that we can apply to this psilocybin effort?
Overregulation, that's a huge problem. If you regulate it to the point where it's completely impossible to operate as a standard business, then people will do what they already do, which is just stay in the black market. And that's not to say that some regulation isn't sensible, but there's a lot of regulation that just wasn't sensible. And when you turn on an industry, for example, like let's say you're going to do strawberries, you go back, 70 years, if there was a problem when they were growing them, such as an outbreak of E. coli because people didn't wash their hands after using the restrooms in the field, you would have to basically build a small law, either as a Senate or an Assembly bill, and basically say we need to correct this thing and make it an actual law so that there's like tracking on an outbreak of E. coli. And so it'd be a little law like that that would go into effect, and it's something that they could focus on. But when it came to cannabis, they didn't really know how to regulate it as an industry, so they took like all these different ideas and they threw them all together, and then they tried to make it work. And a lot of the integration of that just didn't happen. And then you'd have these gaps as far as supply lines and how you cultivate and whether this was legal or whether this wasn't. And so having sensible regulation with the least amount of government oversight that is needed is generally the best. And then that also encourages industry and an economy in itself and an ecology of everything that goes around it to actually self-moderate, to self-regulate and have internal standards that people try to abide by. I think, for example, a big inspiration is the Kombucha Brewers International Alliance. They have their own regulational system that's built into it, and they also aggressively lobby to change things that are important to them. So that's a really good example of something that went through, especially after Prohibition, because technically they border on an alcohol business, because if the alcohol is too high percent-wise in the beverage, then it actually turns into a distillery class permit. So there's a lot of things that you can parallel from other industries. But with cannabis, they just didn't know exactly how to do it, so they threw everything at it at once with Prop 64, and it was a bit of a disaster. Before that, there was two other major things that happened. There was originally basically Prop 215, which turned on cannabis in California in the mid-90s. And then there was some codification that came with it in some form of regulation with SB 420, which actually allowed for a whole different set of situations. And then the next major one is taxation. You don't want to overtax the substance because I don't really know anybody that likes paying for taxes, period. So with cannabis, for example, when California did it in Prop 64, you would end up getting taxed at the point of cultivation. Then that tax would compound into a manufacturing tax. Then because it's still federally illegal, you couldn't operate as a wholesale distributor and get the normal federal breaks you have for business building out like that. And then when it got to the retail side, depending on whether or not the person was considered a patient or a customer by their own designation, you would get hit with two extra taxes. The next one would be an excise tax, which is in essence a sin tax of like 5 to 15%. And then that would compound in finally to the final total sales tax, which is why an eighth of weed costs you $60 in the gray market, and in the black market it's like 20. So if you overregulate it and you overtax it and you make it very exclusive, so very only a few rich people can get access to it, you end up screwing it up. And that's kind of what you end up having now with cannabis in California.
What a wonderful description. I appreciate that comp to kombucha. And I agree with this idea of like guessing on the regulations is a fool's errand. It reminds me of, I do a lot of technology development, product development, and trying to guess the exact use case of what a user is going to do 6 months, 12 months in advance when you have different rollouts, different features. It's a silly endeavor. Get it out there and let the market, let the product figure itself out with your users, or in your case, let these alliances, like with kombucha, let them figure out the best way to regulate it, as opposed to just guessing what the best way to regulate or tax it is, what the best way would be, without even really knowing what it's going to look like. I appreciate that take. Specifically with your initiative, Ryan, really quickly for the layman, what is the essence of this proposition?
It does two major things. The first one is for the private individual. It, in essence, decriminalizes for cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, possession, transport, and consumption of an unlimited amount of magic mushrooms or psilocybin in itself for anyone over the age of 21. The second thing it does is it's actually kind of beautiful. Commercial agricultural production for psilocybin mushrooms would begin January 1st, 2023. And the only two requirements you really need is CDFA approved land for agriculture. That means California Department of Food and Agriculture. So if you already have land that's ag zoned and you grow, lettuce, brassica, strawberries, regular agricultural products, you can in essence just add this to your product line. And then starting April 19th, 2023, regular commercial retail sales could begin. And the beauty of that is you just need to be incorporated in California. And you could be a for-profit, a nonprofit, a not-for-profit, or a sole proprietor in essence. And you could begin selling that if you were zoning it and taking it from an ag zoned property to begin with that was producing it for commercial use. And then in essence, you could sell it at a yoga studio, a bookstore, a cafe, technically even all the way down to a farmer's market level if you wanted to. And the beauty of the taxation component is it won't be taxed for medical, therapeutic, religious, or spiritual use. But if it was listed as a dietary supplement or whatever the equivalent it is when they finally decide how they would want to regulate that term, in essence, you would only pay the local sales tax. So if you went into a yoga studio, bought a chocolate bar for $20, and let's say there was a 10% sales tax on it, you would be walking out paying $22. Yeah. As opposed to if this was cannabis world, you'd be walking out paying like $60.
I've kind of joked that this adventure isn't done until we can buy it, until the average person can buy it. I don't need to go to a doctor. I don't have any access controls or issues. I can buy it anywhere. So I love what you're doing, this idea of decriminalization and commercial legalization. And I think that the reason you're pushing for this is part of your experience and seeing that it's not just the sick, the mentally ill that need this. In fact, there's a larger market of people that are healthy that would like to use it for prophylactic purposes, for cognition, for creativity, for purpose. That is what I found for me over 5 years, Ryan, that it changed me in ways that I could have never expected. And it changed the trajectory of my career and my life. And I'm curious, what has your journey been like with psychedelics?
Well, I was a late bloomer actually when it came to weed. I didn't smoke weed till I was 23, and it's a light psychotropic in there as it is. And then when I did, I smoked a lot of it. I'm not going to lie. And when I was in Laguna Beach, I had just gotten divorced. I met a woman who she would change her name by the seasons. So when I met her, she was like spring and going into summer. And then later she became like winter. So she was a very free spirited person. And she actually went out one night when I was just moving into my spot and picked up some magic mushrooms. And I did it. And that was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. It was a bit crazy, I'm not going to lie, but it was absolutely fantastic. And at that point, I really wanted to understand what was going on with my brain when it came to this. So I looked up some papers. Most of the stuff you found, they were just turning on a couple of studies that were about to happen. And the old studies that were way back in the day, like I was a huge fan of One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest and Ken Kesey and all the madness that went on with that. And then the Tom Wolfe book, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Trip. So it was strange because I'd read a lot of those books, including Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, before I ever did the substances. So from a literary standpoint, I was very curious, but it wasn't until I did it that I was like, oh my God, this is like the next level of where we should be studying everything. So for me and that experience in Laguna Beach, it was amazing. And then when I went to college out in Michigan, I knew from a much younger age, living in the Pacific Northwest, that I basically this weird seasonal mood affected disorder. So whenever you don't get enough sunlight for a consistent amount of time, you just feel depressed because it looks miserable outside. And I suffered from that quite a bit. And when I went to Michigan for school, I didn't realize how bad. I mean, I should have known how bad it was, but I didn't really pay attention to how bad the winters were going to be.
Sure.
And they were horrible winters. Where, like, I use this term all the time. It was like a Norse Viking mythology Ragnarok end of the world sort of thing where the snow just keeps coming down and everybody holds their loved ones until they freeze to death. That was pretty much going to school in Michigan. And at that point, I had some friends in the architecture program that had just graduated and they were out for that break. And I was stuck there because I wasn't coming back to California because I was all the way over there for, 2 weeks as it was. And I was just stuck in my dorm room basically. And I learned how to grow magic mushrooms because they gave me this box that had everything you needed. It had the book on how to grow. It had the actual spore syringe. It was B plus. And then it had a humidifier and a couple of the other elements and just components and then materials you would need to grow with. So I started doing that. And I kept growing it and growing magic mushrooms and then taking them in the winter in Michigan. That really made it easy to get through that. So that was extraordinary. And at the same time, parallel to that, I was also working on this weed documentary tracking things. And through the drug trade that existed as it was in Detroit, which is pretty popular, it would come in from Canada and then it would also come in from other trucking routes. I got to see how the psychedelics moved through the music scene. And, Detroit Electronic Music Festival, Praxis, like all these other things that were going off over there, I really got to experience a whole different collection of substances. And for example, that's when I first did acid. And when I did acid, oh my God, that was amazing. Like I had this plan, I was going to take it and I was going to stick with my friends and go in. And as soon as I took it, I was waiting and waiting. And about like 25, 30 minutes in, I started to really feel it. And then I just like veered off of my friends and had the like craziest 3-day experience ever with that. And that was a lot of fun. And from there, it changed my opinion about a lot of different substances and how we treated them. And suddenly I started trying to figure out, like, what does cultivation mean for this stuff? What does manufacturing mean? What would distribution look like in the future? How would small farmers actually get together and fight large scale corporations? So, like, for example, I don't really think corporations are evil. I mean, I meet a lot of people that say they are, but then I ask them what they do, and it turns out they're actually incorporated like 3 different ways. And then they'd be like, just big corporations are bad. So then I was like, all right, let's take a look at the citrus industry down in Florida. And you actually have collections of true cooperative farmers that got together and make things like Florida's natural orange juice. And there was their competition against other large scale agricultural units. So I had a pretty good breakdown of what it was. And then I spent a lot of time actually in the basement of a cannabis law office in Detroit. And I got to see firsthand what the criminal side of it was. So when, parents would get their doors kicked in by the police, and then their kids would be taken away and child protective services would come in. Or if, for example, a couple was having a breakdown between their relationship and they would actually literally drop dime on each other that, she's growing weed in the closet and he's like, you're growing weed in the garage. And they would literally go after each other. So I got to see all sorts of horrible components of how humanity plays off of each other when it comes to this thing. Because there's so many different industries that are out there just keeping this illegal just to make money for it. We can get into that later, but I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Yeah, the perverse incentives of the parole system. It's obviously fed off of a lot of the drug war, and I think it's something that needs to stop. And I appreciate that story. And I'd like to dive a little bit deeper with you, Ryan, on that one. So curious about a specific transcendent, profound, or mystical experience you've had. And I'll share one that I've had a couple of years ago. It felt as if, Ryan, my consciousness or my visual field or whatever I was in this disembodied state was seeing, but also entangled with this blue light. It was what I would imagine like a Kanye West ultralight beam. And it felt like it was all of space and time stretched and together. And I was it. I was in it and I was it and I saw it, and it becomes very difficult to describe. But it changed the way I looked at the world, and I walked away feeling as if I had experienced nirvana. And I'm curious, what is a profound mystical experience that still resonates with you?
I have a lot, actually. So I would have to say, and this is a weird thing, a lot of people, they have an ability to document what they experience when they're taking a psychedelic. And some of them do it in the form of art, some do it in the form of music. I do it in the form of writing. So one of the craziest things is if you actually, it's going to sound nuts, but I've actually filmed myself writing while under psychedelics before, because I always wanted to do it with painters, but I'm not a good artist, so I can't pull that off. And then when I go back and actually read what I worked on, it gives it like an odd sense of depth and a strange sense of deja vu at the same time, even afterward. So as far as the mystical experience, talking about all sorts of like supernatural stuff that exists out there. I think a lot about like time travel and aliens and things in that general nature. And I feel the best one I ever did, oddly enough, was basically writing in this cafe in a it was like a Greek diner in Detroit. And that was actually when I was on both mushrooms and acid. And I was in there for about 4 hours just writing. They knew me in there. I was like a local, so a regular. And then the other one is basically doing photography. So I do all this black light makeup photography, and that's also fun to trip on when you're doing it as well. And for that, that is something I can go back and then look at and be like, wow, I even still remember that. And some of it, I know it's difficult if you have an experience then and it fleets away from you because you can't really put it all together afterwards. Sometimes it's good to have an experience that's a once-off thing, but I also like to sometimes go back to my better ones when I was more artistic and see what I was able to produce.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that share. There is something special that happens on the artistic side. And I go back and read some of my old journals, and I kind of wish I had filmed myself. And that's maybe something that we can do moving forward as technology starts to support the psychedelic movement. And speaking of looking into the future, Ryan, I think there's obviously a lot of implications for mental health, mental illness, and that's getting the headlines. And maybe it's good to triage there. But as we look at the healthy and the prophylactic use cases and what it can do for stabilizing individuals and enhancing creativity and cognition, let's imagine that this California proposition, it makes it to the vote. You get the signatures required, and then the vote passes. And then let's fast forward 10 years. We've had 10 years of damn near widespread intentional use. What does that world look like?
I'd say both good and bad. I think a lot of people right out of the gate in the first 2 to 4 years are going to throw so much money at so many different third-party services and businesses, and they're basically going to trade off of hype. And a lot of those companies are going to disappear after 4 years because after a certain amount of time, if they're not actually making a product or providing a service that people really want, they'll just phase out. And that happened with cannabis for a lot of different companies that popped up initially. As far as what it means for therapeutic use and, in essence, medical studies and research, I think they're going to use it in essence to treat the majority, is not entirely this, but it's going to be a huge component of it, true addictions for things like opioids, methamphetamines, gambling addictions. And that's going to change how we actually view people. Not just, you take them from prisoners, now they're patients. And sometimes they say, like there's this term, once a skag junkie, always a skag junkie. You can never fix them. I don't believe that. I think, if you could actually fix what's wrong with these people's like emotional state, that's going to have a huge impact on now their biological chemical addiction state. Because most people, when they start out, they're not biologically addicted to a substance. They start out almost psychologically. And then,
Yes.
20 years of meth addicts, we've all seen those pictures of how they've decayed over time. I think that will actually open up an entire new level. It's not going to be like the standard 12-step programs that existed out there, or the Betty Ford clinics. There's basically going to be psychedelic infused clinics that deal with these people on a whole new level. I think when it comes to microdosing, for example, people they consider themselves in a lot of ways to be health conscious. They don't think there's actually anything psychologically wrong with them. I think the microdosing is going to take the edge off, like coffee does to some people, but not have the negative impacts of what it does to your cardiovascular system. And then it would also, in essence, give a lot of sports athletes something to fall back on. I still remember, for example, watching Arnold Schwarzenegger smoke weed in his documentary back in the day. And I was like, holy shit, I can't believe he did that when it was so illegal. And I think what will end up happening is microdosing will become a vital part of people's health regimens just in general. And I've been a proponent for a long, long time. I mean, I've been even on the Doctor Show talking about that going back years. And I think that'll really balance people out in a different way. I've noticed it tends to help relationships as well. That's another thing. People can kind of relax and just enjoy the moment more. And when it comes to creativity, it was something I talked about a little bit earlier, but I think the studies are going to branch out then after that, not just saying like this is great for people that have mental problems, but this is also great for people that may have a mental block on an artistic level. And I think what they'll do is there's a technology called SW Loretta. It's actually a software they use with these EKG skull caps. And it's relatively cheap. And cheap in medical terms, it's like $35,000 to get the software package. The caps cost around $2,000 versus, going into a standard MRI machine, giant magnetic resonance imaging thing, which costs like, $6 to $8 million. These skull caps, you're just basically paying for the skull caps and running the software that downloads it. They'll have people do group interactions for artistic things. Like you'd have everybody watching a movie, and then you would actually be able to have the movie running on one screen, and then you could actually see their brains firing off. Because the beauty of this system, it takes these millisecond slices of the brain, so you'll actually be able to see, like, okay, if there was a violent scene in a movie, what part triggered? If there was a super sexy scene in the movie, what part triggered? If there was a type of music that started playing, you'd actually be able to match up all of that stuff. So people will use it as an upgrade for their creative skill sets whenever they're in the moment. You talk to certain people that program, they're doing like 10 hours sitting there at a computer. Microdosing really helps, all right? And a macro dose, and we're talking like a proper 3.5 grams to 5 grams of the typical mushroom you get out there. And by the way, the 3.5, that's just weed math, basically. That's an eighth. That's the only reason why people started calling it back in the day 3.5 was the perfect thing. It's because generally the people that were selling it, they were using that same math. It wasn't like a perfect dose that you were getting. So that'll change. The lab results that'll come back for this, I do think, for example, if there's a product you intend to sell people that they're going to ingest, it should have some form of lab testing. I don't think it should be the psychotic way they did it with cannabis, which was basically a money grab.
Yeah.
They would do these batch lots of, like, you could only have 50 pounds of weed to test. And this, you should be able to test 2,000 pounds of homogenized chocolate and not have to break it out into 50-pound tests every single mini batch that you do. So the analytical testing will go through the roof, and then people are really going to see, okay, is there an entourage effect like with cannabis with all these other things that exist inside of a mushroom? Or is it straight up the combination of psilocybin, it breaks down to psilocin, and then baecysteine and norbaecysteine, and what other chemicals they end up finding might have a component for this?
Ryan, I gotta cut you off. We're getting short on time.
Okay.
I like a lot of the stuff you're talking about on this brave new world and what this could look like, some of the technology implications. I'm also a fan of this entourage effect, and I'm curious if there's something about these alkaloids in there. We got to transition. This has been a fantastic deep dive. Got to transition to the speed round soul search. Okay, Ryan, question number 1. You get to relive the life of any historical figure. Who you got?
I would go back about 330,000 years ago when humans were first really like Homo sapiens. Jump in there, and with every piece of technology that I have, I'd give them a shot at something different. If I wanted to just have a really good time, Hunter S. Thompson, I'll take it.
Okay. Ryan, question number 2. You are on a desert island for 10 years by yourself, and you only get to bring one mind-altering substance. Who you got?
Magic mushrooms.
I had a feeling you might say that. I'm with you on that one as well. Okay, Ryan, question number 3. Who is the one person that has had a dramatic impact on your career?
This is going to sound totally absurd, but Quentin Tarantino.
I love that answer. Okay, question number 4, Ryan. You're parched, you want to wet your beak, you walk around the block, you pull up a chair in this bar, order a drink, and there sitting next to you is God. And he says, hey, Ryan, dude, big fan of your work. I got to run. I got this goddess I have to meet here in a second. But I can answer one question. What is the one question that you would ask God?
Where have you been for the last few years? Has this been a rough ride, man? Like, is this intentional or what's up?
A little bit of God shaming. Okay, I'm not mad at that. Ryan, last little question. Obviously, a big reason why you're here is this vote, this push to get signatures. What is the action item that you would ask of the viewers and listeners?
Definitely. Go to decrimca.org, download the petition, get your friends to sign the petition, and then mail it directly to us. Our deadline is March 15th, 2022. Volunteer, join your local county teams on Signal. You'll see a whole list there. If you click on any one of those, it'll take you directly to it on your phone. Go out there and get as many signatures as you can. Help spread the word.
Okay, we will get those links in the description. Please go do that, Ryan. I may be seeing you in a week or so. I will have 2 signatures for you. And let me just say this. Thank you for joining the show, but also thank you for what you're doing. This grassroots, yeoman's effort to really change the world and change California at first, but this is incredible work. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Ray. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in person for that coffee. So we'll get there.
Okay, well, thank you for checking out this episode of the Psychedelic Diaries. I am your host, Ray Christian. We'll see you next time.